The death toll from a coal mine explosion in Colombia nearly doubled to 21 after the bodies of 10 miners were found on Wednesday. Rescue teams had been scrambling to pull out the miners who were trapped underground after the blast, as relatives waited for news nearby. The local governor says 9 people made it out alive. Authorities say accumulated gas in 6 coal mines linked to one another exploded on Tuesday in a rural area north of the capital, Bogota. Colombia's national mining agency has suspended all activities at the mines as authorities investigate what led to the incident. Irene Velez is the country's mines minister.
The rescuers had to travel almost 2 miles to reach where the last miners were found at night. The bodies had to be dragged nearly a mile. It was really a collaborative work of all the forces, and so they're physically fatigued.
Fatal accidents like this are common in Colombia's coal and gold mines, especially at illegal or informal facilities. Last year alone, Colombia's mining agency reported 117 accidents at mines, killing 146 people.
Poland announced on Thursday it would send 4 MiG-29 fighter jets to Ukraine, making it the first of Kyiv's allies to provide such aircraft. One of Ukraine's staunchest supporters, Warsaw has taken a leading role in persuading sometimes hesitant allies to provide Kyiv with heavy weaponry. The jets are expected to be delivered in 4 to 6 weeks. Meanwhile, the constant boom of artillery fire filled the air near Bakhmut on Thursday. From inside a hideout, a soldier from Ukraine's 80th Air Assault Brigade gives his assessment of the front lines.
The situation is quite difficult, but stable. The enemy constantly attempts to attack us, and we defend our positions quite effectively. We've been standing here for quite long already, and our brigade hasn't given up any positions.
Their position is not far from where Ukrainian and Russian troops are facing off outside Bakhmut, a hotly contested city. Since a major Ukrainian counteroffensive last year, the war has settled into a grinding conflict of incremental gains, as Ukraine urges its allies in the West to supply more modern military hardware and ammunition. While Russia appears to be in the ascendancy in key areas like Bakhmut, progress is slow and costly, and Ukraine says it is determined to hold out.
Paris became a battleground late Thursday as police tried to quell angry protesters after the French government pushed through an unpopular pensions bill without a vote. As the French Prime Minister announced in Parliament she would trigger special constitutional procedures to enact the reforms. A crowd of around 7,000 people gathered opposite the Parliament across the River Seine in a spontaneous protest. Some people flung cobblestones at the authorities, who responded with tear gas and water cannon. Fires burned in the streets nearby, and cars were set alight. West of Paris in the city of Nantes, black-clad protesters shielding themselves with umbrellas faced off against riot police. They retreated as the gas thickened, but not before they left behind determined messages saying, "Let us destroy what destroys us." Opinion polls show the pension reform plans, pushed by President Emmanuel Macron's centrist government, are deeply unpopular. The bill calls for a higher retirement age of 64, 2 years more than what it was, which the government says is essential to make sure the pension system does not go bust. Left-wing opposition parties say the pension overhaul is unfair and unnecessary, while far-right politicians such as Marine Le Pen have seized upon the government's move to skip a vote to force the bill through, calling it an extraordinary sign of weakness. Unions now call for another day of strikes and action next Thursday against the reform. France has seen weeks of unrest brought by backlash to the bill, bringing widespread disruption to train services, fuel deliveries, teachers, and even garbage collectors walking off their jobs, leaving uncollected garbage rotting on the streets of Paris.
The 2024 Republican race could become a contest between isolationists and foreign policy hawks after Florida Governor Ron DeSantis this week sent his strongest signal yet. He does not believe support for Ukraine is in the U.S. national interest. The outcome of the debate could shape how the party engages with the world for years to come. On the one side are former President Donald Trump and DeSantis. Although the governor has not yet officially declared himself a candidate, he and Trump are the clear frontrunners in the Republican race. Both have dismissed U.S. support for Ukraine and other allies as a waste of resources and said that leaders should pay more attention to issues at home. In a response to a questionnaire on Ukraine from Fox News' Tucker Carlson, DeSantis replied, "While the U.S. has many vital national interests, becoming further entangled in a territorial dispute between Ukraine and Russia is not one of them." On the other side, a slew of declared and likely GOP challengers, as well as party stalwarts, who portray themselves as steadfast defenders of Ukraine and willing to stand up to U.S. foes, including Russia and China.
We'll stand with our allies from Israel to Ukraine and stand up to our enemies in Iran and Russia.
In response to DeSantis' comments to Carlson, former UN ambassador and GOP presidential hopeful Nikki Haley wrote in a statement that America is far better off with a Ukrainian victory. Republican Senators Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham, both former presidential candidates, also criticized DeSantis' comments. "When it comes to Putin, you either pay now or pay later," Graham wrote on Twitter. Republican voters are caught in the middle. 55% of Republicans said the U.S. should support democratic countries when they are attacked by non-democratic nations. And when asked, should the United States continue sending weapons to Ukraine, self-identified Republicans were split 50-50. Overall, support among Americans for providing military aid to Ukraine has waned, falling to 58% in February to 73% in April 2022. It's a trend being watched closely by Kyiv, with one former Pentagon official telling Reuters Ukraine's ability to fight Russia depends on consistent support in weapons and training from Washington and its NATO allies. President Joe Biden insists his administration's position on Ukraine is unwavering, and it's a fight that must be won.
China is seemingly positioning itself as a mediator in the Russia-Ukraine war. Beijing has proposed a 12-point plan for peace in Ukraine, and China's foreign ministry has said it's in communication with both sides. All of this has sparked speculation that China may try to get the rivals to the negotiating table. Let's take a look at why the world power would try to mediate. The country typically doesn't get involved in other countries' conflicts, especially the more distant ones. But analyst Wang Jiangyu, a law professor at City University of Hong Kong, says that trying to broker peace is a low-cost venture that can yield high returns.
If China can do anything, even the slightest, to end the war, or to a lesser extent, to bring the parties together to have a talk, to have, for example, to suspend the war for some periods, for some months, right? That would be something very of tremendous value to Chinese reputation and to Chinese prestige. So it marks the beginning of China playing a global leadership role, which used to be solely played by the United States.
So, what does China propose as a route to peace? In its 12-point paper on the political resolution of the Ukraine crisis, Beijing urges both Russia and Ukraine to agree to a gradual de-escalation and ceasefire, while the plan calls for the protection of civilians and that the sovereignty of all countries be respected. China has refrained from condemning Russia for its invasion. The plan got lukewarm welcomes in both Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine says it will only consider peace settlements after Russian troops leave Ukrainian territory, though later said it was open to parts of the plan. Russia says it will take a nuanced study of the plan, but did not see any sign for a peaceful resolution for now. The US and NATO remain skeptical of China's proposals. NATO says China does not have much credibility as a mediator on Ukraine. So what role could China play, if any? Analysts say it will be hard for China to get Russia and Ukraine to negotiate at all. However, some suggest that President Xi Jinping could spark momentum towards talks. Here's Zhang Yu again.
If the Chinese understanding is, after several months, both parties are exhausted and they want to have the forum to start peace talks, China can offer that, and no other country can do that.
A fruitless attempt by NATO member Turkey to host dialogue in the weeks after the war began last year underscores the difficulty. But some analysts say China is in a better position than Turkey to mediate because it has more leverage over Russia. China does also have some influence over Ukraine, which would not want to ruin its chances of Chinese support for its eventual reconstruction. Whether China could be an honest broker is unclear. China's close ties with Russia mean its role will be viewed with deep skepticism. Days before Russia invaded Ukraine, China and Russia announced a no-limits partnership. And while China has called for peace since the beginning of the war, it's largely reflected Russia's position that NATO threatened Russia with its eastward expansion, and Ukraine's Western allies fanned the flames of war by supplying it with tanks and missiles.
It was a war that began on shaky ground in the aftermath of an America rattled by the 9/11 attacks.
The message is that there are known knowns. There are things we know that we know. There are known unknowns. That is to say, there are things that we now know we don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns. There are things we do not know we don't know.
And 20 years after invading Iraq, the U.S. is still dealing with its consequences and a debate over who is to blame for the fallout. From an empowered Iran and eroded U.S. influence in the Middle East to ongoing combat with Islamic State fighters in Iraq and Syria, experts say the cost of U.S. involvement in Iraq since 2003 is vast, and in the end, enabled ethnic strife and complicated U.S. policy in the Middle East. It was early 2003 when then U.S. President George W. Bush made the decision to oust Iraqi President Saddam Hussein by force, a move supported by Bush's Undersecretary of State John Bolton in the belief that Iraq was harboring weapons of mass destruction.
We have very convincing evidence that Iraq maintains an extensive program for the production and weaponization of weapons of mass destruction and long-range ballistic missiles that have been forbidden to it since the time of the Gulf War ceasefire resolution 687 in 1991.
No such weapons were ever found, and soon after the invasion and toppling of Saddam, the country exploded into violent chaos. But looking back, Bolton tells Reuters that despite Washington's mistakes, he believed removing Saddam justified the costs.
I think it was worth it because the decision was not simply, does Saddam pose a WMD threat in 2003? That was a question. Another question was, would he pose a WMD threat 5 years later? To which I think the answer clearly was yes.
In Bolton's telling, it was a decision made years later that was the most consequential: the 2011 withdrawal of U.S. troops by then-President Barack Obama.
And then for Obama to pulled the rug out from underneath of him yet again.
After years of unrest, the withdrawal left a vacuum soon filled by ISIS militants, seizing roughly a third of Iraq and Syria, and fanned fears among Gulf Arab states that they could not rely on the United States. Jim Steinberg was a Deputy Secretary of State under Obama. He says the administration had little choice but to pull out, given Iraqi resistance to keeping U.S. troops.
There wasn't a meaningful option to really stay unless we were prepared to stay, without the support of the government, which is obviously inconceivable.
Steinberg said the war itself, not the 2011 withdrawal, raised deep questions about Washington's reliability as a partner.
We have this reputation of breaking but not repairing. And that's very dangerous in terms of, because when you're in the region and you have to live with this problem, when we come in episodically and try to make things the way we want them to be, but then at the end of the day pull away, the question is whether people aren't worse off for both parts, which is both the intervention and then the pulling away, than if we had never intervened at all.
Bolton's belief that the intervention and removal of Saddam was worth the eventual cost is not held by many current and former officials, even in the Republican Party. According to the Costs of War project at Brown University, the U.S. price tag to date for the wars in Iraq and Syria is nearly $2 trillion, with more than 500,000 people killed as a direct result of the wars, including military, Iraqi and Syrian civilians, police, opposition fighters, and media. Obama in 2014 sent troops back to Iraq, where about 2,500 remain, and in 2015 he deployed to Syria, where about 900 troops are on the ground. Today, U.S. forces in both countries still combat Islamic State militants, who are also active from North Africa to Afghanistan.
We can win the war on terror.
Years of conflict unforeseen in the early fervor to overthrow an Iraqi leader.